Well, folks are going to be joining us as we go. Welcome to the two of you who are on right now. Here comes Deborah. And as mentioned on the Anabaptist Alliance, we're going to see what we can do about discussing the topic of denominations, conferences, and the various things that go along with them. I have a bunch of questions prepared ahead of time that I thought we could spend our time in discussion tonight. It is a broad topic, it is a big topic, and it is one that might take a while to actually cover. So we'll might need to do this in more than one session, tonight being the first, and maybe more coming up in future weeks here. Since we have a couple different people on here, I would like to go down the line and introduce. Have folks introduce who they are and I'm sorry, who they are and what denominations or church groups or whatever they represent, and see if we can get some conversation going. So, Justin, since you just popped on again, we are using a tool called Hangout Toolbox. It's available in the apps that you can download off the side, and it allows you to get a bar across the bottom. And I can't hear you, Justin. You are on mute somehow.
There we go.
There it is. All right. So as I said, I would like to go down the line and introduce who's who, and basically if there's a denomination you represent or a church group or tradition you represent, to introduce yourself on that line. My name is Robert Martin, as you can see by the label across the bottom of my screen. I was born and raised into Mennonite Church USA denomination. Of course, back in those days, it wasn't called that at the time. It is a Mennonite denomination, Anabaptist denomination, going back quite a long time here in the United States. As I said, born and raised into it, have been Anabaptist, at least in theology thinking, for all of my 40 years of life that I know of, although I've only really adopted it seriously in the last few years. So I'm going to pass the camera over to Ryan, and Ryan can give a similar introduction. Go ahead, Ryan.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I grew up in United Church of Canada, dabbled in a few other denominations before I kind of landed in the Anabaptist camp 2 or 3 years ago now. And I currently attend a Brethren in Christ Church, the Meeting House, in Hamilton, Ontario.
I'm going to give it over to JR now. JR, let us know who you are.
Hey guys, I am a complete mutt, denominationally speaking. I was baptized as a baby, forgive me, into the Episcopalian Church. Kind of not really raised in the church most of my life. Was ordained in the Church of Christ after college. Went to a Quaker college. That's not why I went there. And then, yeah, I worked in a Presbyterian church, a quasi-Southern Baptist church, and the church where I'm at now is actually Christian and Missionary Alliance. Life on the Vine is Christian and Missionary Alliance. But never really identified with any one of those traditions since 2004, I would say. 2005, when I was in grad school at Fuller, is when I probably began to really identify as someone who resonated with the Anabaptist tradition most strongly. So my interest in the conversation actually is mainly I'm part of Ecclesia, is a network of missional churches that the sort of like the fact of Ecclesia is what does a kind of a post-denomination denomination look like? That's what Ecclesia actually emerged, in response to. So I've got that in the back of my head.
Okay. Well, right now it's only the four of us on here. Hopefully, other people will join in as they can. I've added in a couple of folks on the side, and we'll see if they can get into the video conversation as we go. The first question I have in our list of things to discuss is basically, what role have denominations of the church performed in the past? Denominations of church have been around for a while. It's probably, if you go back to the first two Christian denominations, Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic, and then with the Reformation, we just kind of all splintered up. So I'm just wanting to open up the conversation to what roles denominations have played in the church in the past, whether they're good roles or bad roles. We can hash that out as we go, but I would like to discuss that point first. So I'm going to pass it off, first of all, to our mutt on the side over here. See, since he has a bit more of a broader range of experiences, we'll see what JR has to say about denominations at the moment. Put you on the spot.
Yeah, sure. Why not? Yeah, so if I'm speaking in sort of general categories, I feel like I can kind of argue out of both sides of my mouth as to the utility and to the downsides of the fact of denominations, or the thrust of denominations. I don't feel, I mean, just speaking personally, I don't feel like I've ever really benefited from being a direct part of a denomination. I haven't felt like, even though I was ordained in the Church of Christ, I mean, there you're talking about a group of churches that doesn't actually understand itself as a denomination. And really the only reason I sought out ordination at that time was because my best friend wanted me to do his wedding. And so I had to pursue ordination. Yeah, I'm not actually quite certain what more to say besides that.
Okay.
It's not a lot.
Not a lot, but an interesting insight. Justin, what do you got for me?
In the past, I would say I think the way denominations were at least originally intended, and we could argue the success of it. But the point has been to gather around a group of like-minded people around mission. At least is how I would identify the sort of different movements coalescing around something. Yes, there are theological differences. There are things that have popped up that maybe haven't always been in the best interest. But the main point, I think, was to always gather people to say, this is what we think this group of like-minded people identifies as maybe the primary or a primary mission and the way in which God works. Perhaps you can look most easily at the early Anabaptist movement that would say, this is what we think the mission of God is like, and this is how we need to participate. And so the original goal was to get people around that.
Okay. Ryan, what are your thoughts on the role of denominations in the past?
I'll just play pessimist a little bit to feed off of what Justin was saying, but kind of the opposite of that is a lot of the time it has come out of, instead of gathering with like-minded people, it is often about defining yourself as not like those other people that you're breaking away from. I wish that wasn't the case, but in the history of Protestantism, that often is the case, where they just get sick of something that their mother denomination wasn't doing very well, so they go and do their own thing, and often it works out well, and the new denomination does what they wanted to do pretty well. Yeah, I think that's a factor that has to be brought into, is that it can be used to define in opposition instead of as a gathering together. It works both ways.
Okay, so in your thought, it has been more of a detriment in the past than actually creating separation than actually bringing people together. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
I'm not sure I would say that overall denominations have been a detriment, but I do think that that is a factor that goes along with what Justin was saying, that it has cut both ways historically. So you can't really have one without the other.
All right. Welcome, Drew. I see you just joined in. This is my buddy Drew Hart from over Lansdale. And he's the guy that I had that conversation with that I blogged on a little while ago. Drew, the first question we're discussing tonight, and you can chime in if you want to, is the whole topic tonight is about denominations and the conferences and big gatherings and everything like that we have, their role and purposes. So I would like to hear your thoughts. Just historically speaking, Christian denominations of the church, what role have they played in the past that you have seen or heard or experienced? Drew, you there? Sorry. You're not hearing you, Drew. Not getting you, Drew. All right. We'll come back to you in a little bit once you get your microphone figured out there. You shouldn't have come in muted, but let me just make sure. No, he shouldn't be muted. Let's try that. Okay. So what I'm hearing is there is a positive and a negative to denominations and what they do for the church. The positive is there's a like combining with like, people gathering together who have similar thoughts, similar missions, similar ideas. But at the same time, there is an exclusivity that comes in with denominations where we draw the lines of who's in and who's out, and creating an opposition between one person or another. With denominations. Oh, there you are, Drew.
All right, I'm back.
Hey, there you are. So, did you want to try chiming in again?
Yeah, all I was saying was that for me, I grew up in a African American evangelical church that was non-denominational, and so that was the majority of my ecclesial background until I was a part of the Brethren in Christ for about 4 years after college. So my perspective on denominations is probably a bit more limited than maybe some of your all is, but I guess, you know, naturally, I think I've ingrained in my own mind. I was taught almost to see denominations very negatively. I think that during my time with the Brethren in Christ, it did open my eyes to some of the positive aspects of denomination, some of the things that are possible with such a large collective of churches working together, trying to get things accomplished. And so, you know, that's kind of at least the angle in which I'm at least approaching the conversation, if that's helpful at all. But it is very limited in terms of my own experience being a part of a denomination. The church that I grew up in was a part of a network or of assemblies that were primarily in the Philadelphia area, but again, it was non-denominational, so it was completely a voluntary association of churches that worked together, helped plant churches, helped collaborate and do various events and conferences together, things like that. It was very local. That was my experience.
Okay, thank you very much, Drew. the next question, actually the next two questions I have set up here, kind of go along with that first question. What role have denominations performed in the past? I would like to kind of explore a little bit more detail. What are some of the positives and some of the negatives? I know I heard some positive stuff from Justin and some negative from Ryan. So let's start. Have Justin answer the second question. What has the universal church benefited from denominations? What have been the good things that have come out of denominations and such in church history?
Oh, good. I get the easy one. Well, I think for me, and I had a conversation with someone about this the other day, that if we have to identify one positive that's come out of this denominational explosion in the last several hundred years, I think you have to start with you get a better taste and variety of just how wide and diverse and gracious God is. That we can look at every single group and say, well, we don't like this, or we might do this differently. But when you step back and take a look at the whole, and the example I used was that of a kaleidoscope, that each piece is sort of self-contained, but it doesn't really make a complete picture outside of itself. So I think if you're going to say, what's maybe the one top thing that sort of rises quickly, it's that you can have all of these different denominations and theological directions and beliefs and leanings and preferences, and yet you can still step back and look at the whole picture and say, but God is still doing something in and amongst all of these, and they all have a unique flavor and experience that they bring to show the diversity of God.
Okay. Ryan, what's your presentation and idea on the negatives of denominations? Specifically, the question as phrased was, what have been the negatives of denominations for the universal church?
Before I do that, I do want to add a bit to what Justin was saying. The main way that I do think denominations are helpful is that it provides sort of a classification system. Labels can actually be very good if they are used to help communicate better. So when I say I'm an Anabaptist, it carries certain ideas with it. That helps with conversations, including with non-Anabaptists. So that's where I do think denominations definitely can have some place. But the negative, I think, is mainly the idea that we are often defining ourselves in opposition to each other, or at least Protestants are. It's right in the name Protestant. Like, protesting is the core of the identity a lot of the time, unfortunately. So we just find ourselves protesting one thing. Sometimes it's a small thing, sometimes it's a big thing, and divide over it. I remember a while ago, Robert, you had I'm pretty sure it was you, had a blog post talking about a conversation you had with somebody who was Brethren in Christ, which is my denomination, and saying that Mennonite Church and Brethren in Christ, there's really no difference other than emphasis. So why do you need to divide over that? Why can't you work together in a better way if that's all you're talking about is a difference?
Okay.
And hindering your productivity if you're splintering off.
All right. Drew, you said you came from Brethren in Christ, right? Oh, your microphone's off again. There it is.
All right. Yeah, I was in the Brethren in Christ for about 4 years. And there, at least from a collaborative point, I mean, there were certain things that they were able to accomplish that obviously my little network of churches in Philly that I was a part of were not able to do at that same level. So, I mean, I think that pointed to some of the strengths of at least, I don't know if it necessarily has to be a denomination, but I think certainly a much broader umbrella of churches working together has the potential to do some pretty awesome stuff in terms of just mission and collaboration and partnering. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that I've experienced in the church is kind of goes along with what am I still on? Yeah. Kind of goes along with what Ryan was saying, that there's a lot of different churches that have such very similar beliefs and doctrines and everything, that sometimes the separations we build just seem to be very artificial and very petty. A good example is that the church that I had been attending, just down the road, next door to them is another church that is also a Mennonite church. They are separated really by less than a block of distance. And the only reason that I got from their separation in the past was worship style, the kind of music that they wanted to use. One church wanted to be a little bit more progressive in their music choices. The other church did not want to. And some other things. It goes back to the 1800s, to the split between the MC and the GC when it comes to the Mennonite denomination in the U.S. So one church wanted to stay GC, one church wanted to stay MC, so they split. And they are still split. And now they become called an annex church, where they are. I'm not going to
Robert, hey, somebody just Drew. People keep muting you because there's some sort of feedback coming from your computer.
Oh, really?
I think that's it.
Yeah. So I'm gonna mute you for now, Drew, just so it doesn't get the feedback through. Oh, there you go. Now we're good. And then whenever it's your turn to talk again, you can just turn the microphone back on. So that just kind of helps.
It's not a panel. It's not a panel of white guys trying to silence the black guy. Just be clear about that.
Oh, we'd be in trouble if that was the case.
Yeah.
In any case, the churches are still split, and they still seem to fight over petty things. Now, the conversations that are keeping them separated and have been making some problems lately have been, I guess, a little bit more of a serious tone. The church that I just recently left has a ordained, licensed female pastor, and the AMEC church doesn't kind of like that at all. In fact, they pretty much made the separation even deeper when we brought Claudia on board. In addition to that, they are also reluctant to join in with Mennonite Church USA because some of the conversations about homosexuality and joining those churches in. So again, it goes back to what Ryan was saying, that there's more of a sense of needing to separate and divide and distinguish of I'm different than you, and in some sense there's an even I'm better than you, I'm more right than you, when it comes to these conversations. And so that I think is probably the biggest detriment to denominations, both in the past and currently, that we tend to define ourselves as who we are not like and how we are better than them. Now again, we have a mutt on board with us tonight with JR. So we've been talking about benefits and detriments of denominations. JR, what do you think in your experiences between all the different flavors that you've tried out and worked with in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm prototypical of the sort of like the Protestant evangelical ethos, right? That like it's this imagination that you can be, or that it's a benefit in some way, shape, or form to be this autonomous, free-floating individual. All you need is Jesus sort of person, and I kind of get that. But as I'm sitting here listening to what people are saying, something that's becoming clearer to me is the way in which denominations help churches and Christians to become to get in touch with like the historical rootedness of I mean, at the best, it's like the great Christian Orthodox tradition, right? Like that we're rooted in that history, not just out there creating our own space or whatever. And it's the great irony of all this is that so much of it stems from what happened at the Protestant Reformation, Luther not really wanting to break from the Catholic Church but wanting to see it reformed. And because there was this really clear separation and break, now you have all these splinter denominations that have created their own histories. So it's like history on top of history. And so you can belong, it's a convoluted issue now to belong to a denomination in terms of like historical rootedness. Is the primary manner of a congregation's historical rootedness within a denomination primarily focused on the history of that denomination, or the larger story of like being enmeshed in the great tradition of the Christian family? And so for instance, I mean, I'm asking actually this question right now of in what ways is it really important for me to think about, if we're going to be at Life on the Vine, which is part of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, like in what ways is it important for me to take steps towards becoming more immersed within that denomination because of how it can connect me to the Christian history? Or would that actually happen? That's the question I have is like, it's a good idea that denominations help churches to do that. It's another thing to evaluate the actual effectiveness of that happening.
Okay. Anyone want to add to that? I'll bring John into the conversation here in a minute, but anyone want to add to what has been said or expand on part of the conversation about the good or the bad of denominations historically and in present day? Just kind of, let me know if you want to speak, and I'll just focus the camera on you then. Anyone?
Well, one of the questions that I had, maybe more specifically to JR and some of his involvement with Missio Alliance, is it's certainly not a denominational structure that's emerging, or at least I don't think that's your goal. But how do you see that trying to either transcend the denominationalism that has come in, or work alongside that, or shape the conversation, or maybe whatever the correct descriptive of that is? How do you see this sort of larger Anabaptist tent trying to work inside of that?
Well, Missio Alliance isn't necessarily a decidedly Anabaptist outfit in and of itself, and so it's this sort of broadly evangelical, holiness, Wesleyan, Anabaptist sort of thing. At least it's informed by those traditions, and so I would say Missio Alliance is a sort of entity that seeks to have relationships with schools and denominational entities and things like that. And our hope and aim would be to see, I don't even know the best way to say it. For a shorthand, I'll say like missional renewal emerge, to happen within those denominational structures in the lives of local churches. And so I would say if you're Anglican, that's fantastic. Missio Alliance is an entity that wants to help the Anglican denomination and Anglican churches figure out how to engage the pressing issues of mission in an increasingly post-Christian society. And
Okay.
if you're Baptist, if you're whatever, so I mean, we're not really taking aim at like creating a new denomination or a stance on denominationalism. It's more about how do we help churches in whatever tradition they find themselves engage some of the common issues that we're facing.
Okay.
And if
John.
they become Anabaptist along the way, so be it.
John, you coming in late in the conversation. if you want to just give a kind of a brief introduction of who you are and what denomination or tradition of church you represent here tonight. And then the topic of conversation at the moment is what roles the denominations have performed in the past for the church. What's the good, what's the bad, what's the ugly. Just feel free to speak your mind on it.
All right. Yeah, my name is John Ayala, and I'm mainly come from a non-denominational background. So that's my denomination, is non-denomination. I know a lot of people don't like to see it that way, but I've kind of come to see it that way because I come from the Southern California version of Calvary Chapel, so they're kind of a denomination unto their own. They have their own set of beliefs, they have their own way of seeing Scripture and the Bible and certain teachings, so in that way, they're kind of their own denomination, even though they say they're not denominational. Well, as far as good and bad, I used, Calvary, considering themselves a non-denominational church, always really looked upon denominations as a bad thing. They never really saw it, and of course, they kind of taught that. So, all growing up in my life, it's been always that denominations are bad and non-denominations are good, and all you need is Jesus, like I think somebody mentioned earlier. But yeah, I think as I've grown older and learned a lot more about different denominations, there's a lot of things I think that are good. They've actually kept certain traditions alive, which not all of them are bad. I think in a way, sometimes traditions are good in a way that they kind of root us and ground us in certain things, and in other ways, certain traditions aren't so good because they kind of take us off on a different tangent, and maybe help don't really do us any help in trying to understand God and His plan, because the denominations kind of set their stance on certain things, and you better not go against it, or else you're not going to be part of the denomination anymore. And that's kind of where I am right now with the Calvary, non-denominational churches. I don't really go to them anymore. I go to a small church now, and they're non-denominational. So, and we're kind of even more free-floating than that because we're kind of on our own. We don't have a parent church organization. We initially broke off from another church, but that church has since gone, and it's kind of moved on and left us on our own. So we're just kind of making it up as we go along. And I'm just glad I found the Anabaptist, way of seeing things. It kind of seems to line up more with, I think, I've talked to Robert and both Justins and Ryan, that, it comes to like, my discipleship to Jesus has brought me to Anabaptism. It wasn't really a denominational thing. It was kind of, as I tried to understand more about how my Christianity is mostly based on Jesus, that it should, more Christocentric faith and hermeneutic, and trying to see things that way kind of brought me to understanding the Anabaptist way of seeing things. So that's my 2 cents.
All right. Anyone else have anything to add? There's a couple of questions that have come up on the sidebar over here that we might want to get into on this topic. But before we hit those, does anyone have anything else they want to add to this? Just kind of wave your hands or start talking or whatever, and I'll click on you and get you in here. And yes, Drew, that means you can unmute yourself if you need to. All right, if there's nothing else on that, there was 2 questions that came up in this conversation about the good and the bad. One of the things that was interesting, a couple people, John here most recently, and a couple other people mentioned a historical rootedness that comes with having a denomination. That by saying I'm Mennonite, that there is actually a very long history, and I can point to specific people, specific events, conversations that have happened over the past 500 years, that I can say I'm connected to that longer history of things. So, what's your opinion on that? Is that an important enough idea when it comes to denominations to say, you know, we can't necessarily throw out the idea of denominations? That as we are talking about things and as we are working through things, should we keep in mind that idea of that historical rootedness? Do denominations help with that? Do they hurt with that? Are they necessary in that part of the Christian experience? Open up the floor. I'm going to actually, Drew, if you wouldn't mind giving your ideas on that.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important topic. I think that denominations do help, you know, keep traditions alive. They do help inform the practices that are, you know, life-giving often for local churches. And I know in my own experience, again, having grown up first in an African-American evangelical church, that I mean, I think most evangelical churches have a 50-year memory in terms of church history. You know, 1950s is like the start of church history and devotional life and all those things. And so I think there is something significant about having a tradition that goes much longer than that. You know, it was the first time I stepped into a Brethren in Christ church that I participated in, like foot washing and things like that, that I think are profound. I think those are great traditions and practices for a church to have, and that often are absent in churches that don't have a denomination that protects some of those important things. Now, again, obviously there are a whole bunch of other things that come along with a denomination that I think can get ugly as it weighs down some of those, you know, so that you get those good practices and you get all the other baggage along with it. And is it worth it or not? Can you keep those practices without the denomination? Probably. But I do think that a large collective of people valuing some of those traditions and practices, I think have proven to be at least helpful in those types of discipleship and formational aspects of the church.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm already.
Again, I'm going to call on you on this one because you have a much broader background in church history. I might come back to you too, John, with your non-denominational aspect of things. What do you feel is the role or detriment of that historical rootedness of belonging to denomination? Again, you have the Missio Alliance denomination. You're with JR, but again, I don't know how far back. I don't know my history of that particular denomination. I'm not Missio, Christian and Missionary Alliance. But where does the role of history of a church grouping come into play in what goes on within denominations?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I mean, the only thing I can really think of is, I mean, liturgy, like worship liturgy and practices, right? I mean, unless you're talking about actually historically educating parishioners in a classroom setting, you know, what is it that moves us forward or roots us in a tradition besides what do we experience together? How do we worship together on Sunday or whenever it is that we worship? What do we experience? What are the narratives that are sort of like shaping our imagination? And then what are the practices that we engage in together as a body? So, you know, like Drew mentioned, foot washing, like that's something that not many traditions practice, and yet if you grow up in a church community that practices it, your imagination, your identification with a certain aspect of Christian history is going to be shaped by that. and so there is, it's one of those like more caught than taught sort of things in that regard, right? That you step into a congregational setting, and because it it identifies with a particular denomination. Its worship liturgy takes a certain shape, and the way that it structures itself takes a certain shape. So it's more osmosis than just passing on information about what you're a part of. And so, but I mean, like with Drew, it's a very, especially for evangelicals, like it's a really short history, right? There's just not a lot there. I mean, I mean, you could go into some random non-denominational church and find more than in some others, but by and large, it's going to be a pretty, it's going to be a pretty one-on-one sort of like. It's not really about, most evangelical churches, non-denominational evangelical churches, take shape around the preconceived idea of it's really just about you and Jesus, not about a church history or tradition.
So that idea of Jesus alone, it sounds like in that part of the conversation that it seems people want to kind of say, well, that history is there, but we don't need to remember that history. We don't need to connect to that history. We've got Jesus, we've got the Gospels, we've got the Scriptures. That's all we need. We don't need to know all the rest of the stuff that goes on with what the church is and who it is and who it's made up of. I think that's one of the experiences that I have not had, having been born and raised in the Mennonite denomination. We joke about the Mennonite game, where you meet up. Yeah, Drew's down there laughing. You meet up with another Mennonite or another brother in Christ or somebody, and the first thing you do is try to figure out how you're related. Do you know this person? Do you know that person? You play the 6 degrees of separation from Menno Simons kind of thing. It's how it goes. And so for whatever reason, I've always had this deep sense of history in my faith. In some senses, though, that deep sense of history can be a detriment. Well, we've always done it this way, or that's not the way my grandparents did it, or that's not the way we've always done it before, and how dare you try to change what has worked for hundreds of years. That kind of mindset plays into it as well. That while there's a theological rooting of where you came from, those traditions of this is what we've always done can hold us back sometimes. And I think that's one of the things that, while I love my denomination, I don't see myself right now, although there may be some questions about a couple things, I don't see myself right now leaving Mennonite Church USA, but if there's anything that would send me out of Mennonite Church USA, would be too strong of a sense of this is the way we've always done it and we're not going to change. That mindset of we've got it right, this is rock solid, etched in stone, never going to change anything about it ever again. If we become that way, then I am probably going to move on, because I don't think that is necessarily faithful to Christianity. I have some conservative views that I want to preserve some things of the past, but at the same time, I have to recognize that God is not a static being. He's living and moving, and if the world around us is changing, then the way that God relates to that world is changing, and then we as instruments of God may need to change some of how we do things. So I'm going to shoot it over to Ryan now. I think you had a little bit more of a historical training in your seminary education than I did. I didn't go for the full MDiv. What's your thinking on this idea of the historical rootedness that comes along with having a deep denominational tie?
Yeah, I did do pretty much as much history as I could get away with during my master's. It was my biggest area of interest. And for me, it is fairly important to be able to point to where things came from in history, not necessarily the group identification, which is what we're primarily talking about here. But to be able to say, well, this theological idea emerged in this context, and that helps me understand, well, in that case, is it still relevant now? And to be able to ask those kind of questions from there. Yeah, I think the group identification, it's still somewhat important to me, but not as much so as that idea of being able to latch on and say, well, this is what the Orthodox Church has been saying for a long time. This is what a particular stream has been saying. It emerged in this era. For those who read my blog, I do a lot of criticism of the modern era and thought that has come out in the last 500 years. And that's largely out of my historical interest to look at that and say, well, this emerged as a reaction to something else that was going on, and we don't need that anymore. It's not helping anymore. So that's why I think history is really important, and where evangelicals are really missing out with their short history, the 50-year history that Sue suggested.
Okay.
Yeah, group identification, a little bit. I identify as an Anabaptist. I don't even identify as a particular denomination usually. And that is partly to tie in to say, yeah, this is the stream that I'm most aligned with, but even that is more for just identification, for being able to label myself succinctly, as opposed to feeling like I need to have that community around me historically.
Yep. Drew, what part is that history played within the Black evangelical background that you witnessed or experienced? I mean, you've been in Brethren in Christ Church, but you said you had your history in Black evangelical, and I think you're at a Black evangelical congregation right now. What's that history do for your group identification and for your theology and practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably in almost every Black tradition in America, there's a complex identification with our own tradition. So, like, for example, historically, I know that my church, the Black evangelical church tradition that I came out of the Plymouth Brethren tradition. Which actually came from Jamaica. And so this Plymouth Brethren has nothing to do with Anabaptists. But there's no connection. I mean, if you asked anybody in our church who the Plymouth Brethren were, they would have no clue. As far as they're concerned, we might as well be a Baptist church. And so, I mean, I think there's a huge disconnect, I think, historically with the church that we came out of, and I think that's very common in terms of at least the traditions and practices of most Black churches, whether you're Baptist, whether you're AME, whether you're Pentecostal, is that at some points, you know, the African American tradition in some sense blending with whatever tradition that you received. And then I think there's a disconnect between the group that gave it. Like, what does, you know, somebody living in North Philly have to do with Plymouth Brethren? I don't know. It seems it almost isn't very helpful of a tradition for us to look at. I think the most helpful thing, which I think a lot of Black Christians do, which isn't necessarily only to look at their denomination, but to track Black Christianity, Afro-Christian faith for the past 400 years. That's been more helpful, I think. You know, look at Frederick Douglass, look at Sojourner Truth, look at Ida B. Wells, look at Martin Luther King, and you know, all the various folks throughout history that have kind of shaped what it means to be a part of the African American tradition here in America in terms of church. And so I think for me, my own tradition is, I mean, again, it's a very short memory, and so those who aren't being rooted in at least African American history, I think, don't really have much to offer as far as tradition goes, as far as historical memory and narrative. I think in the African American church, if either you're grabbing onto that larger 400 slave narrative and thinking about what God has done to take us out of where we've been and to where we're going, otherwise there's not much we're working with. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you have a historical tradition that at least goes back as long as the Mennonite tradition. We are 1500s, and you come around 1600s, 1700s. So there's still a deep sense of history there, in the black denomination. So while you may not connect to Plymouth Brethren or Brethren in Christ or Baptist necessarily as those particular denominations, that history is definitely formational, and it certainly drives a community. I'm remembering my experience with the Haitian church in where exactly are they? Part of Eastern District Conference of Mennonites in Philadelphia. It's a Haitian immigrant congregation, and their connection to their island roots and their history on the island and their own past coming in, that has formed a community there of their ethnic history, and then they've tied in their Anabaptist theology to that, and it's really a rather neat experience to see how that other history, they don't have the Swiss-German history that I have, but they've brought in this Anabaptist feel, and they brought their own Haitian history, and it really makes a very neat blend within that congregation. And I appreciated singing familiar hymns in Creole. That was really kind of neat. And for them, they were still connected to their brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and grandparents who didn't come to the United States, by being able to share the language, share the food, share the culture, share all their personal histories together, to bind them in a community. And as I mentioned in the article I made after my family reunion this weekend, it's those artifacts, those histories, those stories that help us to build our community identity, that when we can pick up an item or tell a story and have a lot of people say, yes, I know that story, or yes, that item has meaning to me as well, then there's a form of community that comes out of that common history as well. I would like to move forward. We've got about half an hour before I want to end this conversation tonight. And again, this is the topic is much broader than what I think we can fit into tonight. So we'll probably pick this up again. I'm thinking 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. But before I move on, is there anyone who wants to add anything more to this idea of historical rootedness as being one of the benefits or good things that denominations do for a community? Haven't heard much from you, Justin, on this particular one. Did you want to add anything to this?
The only thing that I kept thinking as we're talking about it is, I think there's the positive aspect and the negative aspect, and it's probably not simplified quite that easily. But the positive aspect is that regardless of where you might come from, you can entrench yourself into the story and history of the people and find that you belong. The downside, I think, is, and I'm speaking as a person that has grown up in Mennonite and the Baptist congregations, it quickly becomes very ethnocentric. And so I identify with the Anabaptist heritage because I have the right last name. And I can play the Mennonite game. And so I can, in a sense, claim, the story of Dirk Willems as my own because he's, 3 cousins removed from me or something. And I think we have to watch that dichotomy. That the positive aspect is everybody's welcome, and you can claim Dirk Willems' story as your own when you identify with the faith and the movement that he was trying to accomplish. And yet the backside of it is that can also become a stagnant thing when we want to say, no, these are our people, no, this is our perspective, no, this is our way, this is the way we do it, because this is our type of people. You know, and so when we talk about historical rootedness, we need to be clear, are we talking about the ethnic rootedness, which I think is a big hindrance, or are we talking about the theological rootedness, which basically says, everybody's welcome, come on in?
Well, that's a good transition to the next question that Ryan brought up. Does anyone want to add anything or respond to what Justin had to say before I move on?
Robert, can you say the next question, and then I'll know whether or not I need to say something now or wait?
Sure. The next topic we want to go on to is kind of plays into this. We were talking in some sense about historical rootedness that comes from a common history and ethnicity, even that Mennonites themselves are an ethnicity. But there's also Ryan brought up a good question about what role do statements of faith, statements of doctrine, common teachings play when it comes to denominational groupings. Good, bad, indifferent. How do those denominational statements play into this conversation? So I don't know if that adds to what you wanted to say, JR, or if you want to continue on the ethnic historical rootedness for a moment yet before we get into that topic.
Yeah, let me just, something that's kind of going through my head here as I was listening to Drew talk and the other bits of information, and I don't exactly know how we're using the word ethnic right now, but I'm thinking actually in terms of race and how, like, it's, I don't want to say it's just dawning on me, but it's coming through really clearly to me right now how ill-equipped a Protestant evangelical, someone who's reared in standard Protestant, historical Protestant evangelicalism would be to engage at an ecclesial level with members of other cultures and races who might also identify as Protestant evangelicals, and part of that is just the sheer individualism of it. But it's like historical nature as well. I'm thinking about Yoder's body politics and how, like, if those things were actually manifest in local congregational life, because they're rooted back into the narrative of the people of God in the New Testament, then even if we have other issues to work out, say white, black, racial issues to work out, that's a whole other layer of something. At least at the straight ecclesial level, and Drew, hear this as a question, like I'm just processing this in my head, and I'd love for you to come back. At least at an ecclesial level, if I'm in a church tradition that's practicing Yoder's body politics as rooted in the first century Christian narrative, and I encounter a brother or sister from another race or culture who also is in a tradition shaped by practicing body politics from the first, like, there's a point of, like, there's a ground level at which we meet to work out maybe other issues that isn't quite there if, like, I'm just immersed in a church context and that's completely ahistorical.
I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that, Drew.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I think that's why my experience with the Anabaptist tradition is that this multiracial Brethren in Christ church, where 2 out of the 5 of us pastors were African American, where right now the church is probably 30% minorities and growing. When I started, it was probably 10 to 15%. So this is a church where minorities are being able to hold on to their identities and their formation and their traditions and what shaped them in terms of faith, but also enter into the Anabaptist story, because I think the practices and the perspective of the church and where people are coming from are connecting. They are being able to there's a lot of common grounds for for them to then work out race and other things like that. But there's a starting point, that I think is helpful as a foundation that I think, most evangelical churches, because they're so ahistorical, it doesn't take, I don't know how many times I write a thing and somebody says, why are we worrying about the past, right? That's from usually evangelicals. It's not Mennonites who are saying, why, are we worrying about the past? So there is a certain way in which that kind of tradition opens up to taking serious somebody else's tradition as well, which I think is helpful. Yeah.
Does that answer your question, JR?
Yeah, it's at least it's a helpful line of discourse anyways. Like, it's I appreciate hearing from Drew on that. It's just really striking to me. I'm just thinking through people that I know who, in their church experience, because there's nothing about their Sunday worship experience or the larger practices of their local life in a local church that shapes their imagination or them personally in a way that's connected to first century Christianity. That I think, like, they're handicapped right from the get-go in terms of trying to connect to anyone else who's been reared in a similar way, because it's just so individualistic and so ahistorical, just to keep coming back to that word, I guess. And how, it just kind of like we're shot in the foot right from the get-go. And so I guess I'm not meaning to make a case for denominationalism, but I am saying at the very best, if a denomination actually is successful in helping people to be shaped at the level of a local church into the great Christian story, that there are manifold benefits that come from that being the case. But again, like I said a lot earlier, the idea that could happen and the idea of whether it actually gets played out are two different questions in my mind.
Yeah, that's a difficult place to be in, because it does, as the conversation Drew and I had a while ago, it takes a sense of needing to make room to sit down and listen to the other. I have a very Swiss-German background to me, so there's very much a history to that. I can point to the castle outside Bern, Switzerland, where my ancestor was held prisoner in, fleeing, when he was arrested by the Swiss Reformed. So I had this, I have a 300-year history in my family of my particular tradition. So this is where I'm steeped in. This is my perspective. This is how I view things. And Drew has a completely different history in his background, completely different experience. I grew up in rural western Maryland. He grew up in inner city, Norristown. To have a conversation where we can mutually work, we need to be able to. I don't want to go ahistorical. I don't want to deny my past, but I want to be able to make sure I leave room for Drew to live within his context and express things within his context and take a step of listening and learning. I think that goes back to what you said, JR, about body politics. That's the body politics that I see that is essential in that conversation. I know of people who have tried coming into a Mennonite church that cannot connect because while they want to be able to adopt that history, the folks who are already there, who have been living in this history for years, not explicitly, but there's an implied you don't belong because you don't have that history, and it's very hard for them to they want to adopt the community history and even some of the ancient history that comes along with that, but they're kept at arm's length because they don't quite belong. So there's a negative to having that historical rootedness in, and I think you mentioned this, JR and Justin both, that we can get too caught up in it and too separationist in it. But on some level, if we can go far enough back in our history, I think this is what you were getting at, JR, if we can go back to, well, we all are following Jesus. We are all trying to live together in a community, to be an ecclesia, a church together. If we can get to that level in our conversations and our relationships, then we can start building some of the other more complex discussions and wrestling points and everything in how we relate.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say. So I mean, like the people that Drew talks to who say, "Hey, man, why you got to get so hung up on history?" or like, "Why you got to be so hung up on the past?" That to a certain extent, I feel like one of a helpful response might be that we actually have to go further back. If at least if we're talking at the level of Christian to Christian, and say it's not to negate the more immediate past and Black history in America and any other kind of racial things you might want to bring in, Latino experience, or in terms of those, like the recent history, the recent past, like that all is magnificently important to get worked out. But for Christian to Christian relations, that it's actually the common history that we share in Christ that we begin with, and being shaped into that story, out of which then we can begin to engage those other pressing issues of things that have shaped us historically. Maybe that's as ethnic Mennonites, maybe that's as Black Americans, maybe that's as Polish immigrants. Is any kind of number of other recent histories you might be able to speak about. But anyways, I don't know if that made sense. I'm just going through my head, like, what would be, the fruitfulness of a positive denominationalism working itself out for the good of Christian to Christian relations.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Can I just add one thing?
Oh, sure. Hang on.
I guess I'm not sure if we're able to talk about getting back to how different communities talk about who Jesus is and following him faithfully, separate from the narratives. Like I think so. We'll take Anabaptist history. The understanding and recovering who Jesus was. For the Anabaptists, I don't know if they can talk about that without talking about this history that also shaped and helped them see Jesus. And I don't think in the Black church we can talk about recovering and understanding who Jesus is without talking about finding him in the slave fields. So I don't know. I mean, I hear you on one level, but on the other hand, I still think it's still connected to that narrative in some way or form, in terms of, that I can say, my ancestors found Jesus while they were slaves, and while they were being taught by Christians who Jesus was in a different way, and that they resisted that interpretation and believed that Jesus was their friend and he was their liberator and he was their co-sufferer. So I think, I don't know. I'm not sure how I don't know if we can completely separate our engagement with Jesus, because it is always situated in concrete from the narratives in which we find Jesus in, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
That comes down to that idea of incarnational again. That let's jump history. Let's do an alternative history. If Jesus were to have been born as the first time in the deep south of Alabama in 1700s United States, what would he be doing? Who would he be identifying with? Where would he be walking and living? And I would think that he probably would be with the black slaves in the fields of the plantations, just like he would probably be today on the streets of our big cities with the people doing the sex trafficking trades, the drug addicts and the homeless people. He wouldn't be necessarily filling a pew in a church. He would be incarnated into a particular situation. He was incarnated as a Jewish carpenter, as an oppressed people in an occupied territory. But when he came initially, but he expressed an identification with the people where they were, and I would see that in the whole span of history of the scriptural witness, when God interacted with somebody, he came to where they were. He didn't bring them to where he needed them to be to interact with them. He entered into their lives directly and then walked with them from there. I hear and agree with what you're saying, Drew, that we can't necessarily make Jesus an ahistorical figure. We have to recognize that we're all encountering him within our own contexts and our own histories. And to some sense, denominations kind of help with that, in that it allows us to be able to give an expression to, here's how we've encountered Jesus within our common history. But then the danger point is we can't elevate that above somebody else's experience. We can't say that the Swiss-German Mennonite experience of Jesus is somehow better, a more truer incarnation of Jesus than the Black Baptist incarnation of Jesus, or the Episcopalian incarnation of Jesus. That they're not necessarily one supreme over another, but they are all people who have met Jesus at a particular place and time, in a particular situation, and something's grown out of that in their expression. So I think that's one way that history plays a role, and I don't think we can necessarily deny that historical role in our ecclesial formations. Anyone else want to add to that? We're still talking on the topic of history and denominations and the connectedness. Okay. The next quick question. We only have 15 minutes left before I wanted to call it quits tonight. And again, there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to denominations and how we gather and everything. The next question that came up in some of the other stuff that we were talking about, we've talked about the history, but we have things like the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed that go way back in history. Doctrinal statements. Mennonite Church USA has the Confession of Faith and Mennonite Perspective from 1995. That is a collection of 20-some-odd doctrinal statements and discussions. And different churches have the same kinds of things. Even non-denominational evangelical, you go to their church website, you will find, here's a list of statements of what we believe. So what is the role that those statements of faith play, either in the past or currently, when it comes to how the church interacts when it comes to denominations? Ryan, since you brought up the question in the sidebar initially, I'm going to let you start this one off.
Yes, the main thing I was thinking of, it came out of John's comment about how non-denominational churches have the freedom to explore their own theology more than a denominational church does. And that came across as strange to me, and I realized why the difference was. Because some denominations approach their statement of faith more in a prescriptive manner, as in, you have to believe this to be able to fit in here, and others approach it in more of a descriptive manner, where it's just, well, this is what we're currently thinking. And the denomination that I grew up in is definitely on the descriptive end, so they'll change things and change it somewhat radically every 20 or 30 years. They'll write up new content. And this flows into the last conversation, too, about incarnationally, are we willing to change our theologies, and does that sacrifice the rootedness in history that we were just talking about? If so, I don't think you can go completely to one extreme or the other, obviously, but I don't know exactly how we balance that descriptive versus prescriptive and how those statements of faith fit in.
Anyone want to respond to Ryan or to the question? One of the things that again, it goes to that sense of we're better than another denomination. I think one of the reasons why even non-denominational churches come up with a statement of faith, a doctrine of faith, is to create that sense of separation of here's what we believe, and there's an implication of, and if you don't believe this, then you're wrong. Mennonite churches do it all the time. We believe this, 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 and this, and if you disagree with us, well, then you're wrong. We're better. It's been my experience in my history in the Mennonite church that we do a pretty good job, as much as we like to talk about the love of Jesus and his sacrificial nature. We do tend to draw that line in the sand and say, don't cross this line or else. I mean, the history of the shunning and the ban and everything in the Mennonite church and the Amish church, of that extreme discipline of toe this line or you're out. And these doctrinal statements of faith are so frequently used as making that decision of whether or not you are in or out with this particular group. I think, historically speaking, Anabaptists have never really been too strong on solid creeds. I mean, even the 1995 confession that the Mennonite Church put out, it came out of a lot of conversation, and it was intended to continue as conversation from that point on, but so frequently it gets used as here's what we believe and nothing else. And I think that is essentially a problem across the board with any denominational grouping of the church. We have a set of doctrines, believe this, this is the only right way to believe, and anything else is suspect. At the same time, it's good to know what you believe, what your teaching stances are, how you view certain topics and certain issues. Those are important starting points for the conversations. But I think we get too tied up in these doctrinal statements and kind of lose sight of the bigger picture of what we're supposed to be doing with them as we walk in this world, and get too black and white, too solid and set in stone on them. That's kind of my thought on some of these. Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that I think there's both a need for, affirming what you believe. I don't think that churches should stop proclaiming what they believe. But at the other hand, I mean, I think it always has to be recognized that they're historically situated statements, and that our vision is always, it's fragmentary. It's, we're finite. We don't see the whole picture. And so we're just getting a glimpse of Christ and trying to profess him in our context, at this time, in this particular situation. And so I think if statements could be seen with a little more humility, recognizing our human finitude, I think that they could play a healthy role as well, in terms of also, keeping us focused on mission, keeping us focused on why we exist, and the proclamation of Jesus Christ as Lord, I think. So I think that there's certain things that they're able to do. Even you think about the Mennonite Church, I mean, just the historic peace position, and nonviolence, and non-coercion, and, challenging domination and calling us towards servanthood. I mean, these are things that have been passed on because of proclamation, and because of talking about, what does it mean to be a part of this tradition, something that I think was healthy that was passed on. But I think it can still, at the end of the day, I think we need to always see these statements as situated and momentary, and as culture changes, we need to be able to continually try to make another fresh proclamation of who Christ is for this time. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of what I was hoping this conversation would get to. Because the denomination that I grew up in was so far on the opposite extreme, where the statements of faith really didn't mean anything. Technically, to be ordained, you had to have general agreement with the statement of faith. but what constituted general agreement was extremely fuzzy. So you could have some where really there was pretty much no agreement, and it would still be okay, and then the next statement of faith could be significantly different because now you have different people making those decisions, and so that's completely erased any sense of attachment to Orthodox Christianity or to their specific tradition. So making sure that you have that without it becoming, and this is the only way that Jesus can be understood ever.
Right.
There's a fine line in there that needs to be walked.
Yeah. Justin, you had a conference with U.S. Mennonite Brethren not too long ago. If I remember correctly, from what you and I shared online a couple times, your confessions of faith, I think, were part of that conversation. How you were dealing with certain parts of it. Am I correct in that? And if so, can you want to share what you guys have been working through?
Yeah, I that's sort of the conversation that I have running in the back of my mind, that we're currently discussing what has been, since our inception as Mennonite Brethren, the stance on peace and nonviolence and non-resistance. That we've had that as an article, as part of our confession of faith, as part of the core understanding of what we've meant to be this type of people, but it's never been one of those that's really sort of been emphasized and taught in the way that, we pass this faith tradition on, this faith perspective, this stance towards war and nonviolence on to the next generation. It's sort of been one of those things that we say we believe this, but then it never really comes up in conversation. And the result over the last, 20, 30, 40, 50 years has been we have one group of people that still hold to that, and people that have migrated in from other faith traditions that don't necessarily hold to that. And so now we're forced to ask ourselves the question, does this peace and nonviolence stance still reflect who we are as a people? And so I had another round of conversations this last week with some people about a tentative revision that they've put out and are asking for feedback on. And what they're trying to say is, very clearly, we think Jesus calls us to reconciliation and to promote justice, and less from a specific, this is how we think that gets bared out in traditional pacifist, nonviolent ways. Because that's been upsetting to some people that have come in and found a home in our Anabaptist churches. And so we're sort of largely saying, we still want to promote peace and justice and reconciliation, but we're going to not try and define what that looks like as we have historically. And I look at this conversation and I say, this has been a part of our story, but it's been one that we haven't really taught or tried to touch on. That, if I wanted to pastor and come in and say, well, I only believe two parts of the Trinity, I'm very quickly going to be disciplined in some way, because that's a core conviction you don't get away with critiquing. And yet we have this one where it's sort of been, we say we believe this, but you don't really have to be a part of who we are. And it's changed our story over the last couple of decades to the point where we're now having to say, do we need to revise our stance? Do we need to make a different proclamation? Do we need to, perhaps in the good sense, that what they're trying to do is say, do we need to broaden our understanding of what it means to be peacemakers? And the question that they're asking is, maybe we've been defining it too narrowly, and we need to look at expanding it a little bit.
Okay. Anyone else want to add to this idea of the denominational confessions? One of the things that comes to mind is, I don't remember where I read it or saw it, but even the door direct confession by the Mennonites way back when was never really intended to be a solid, here's what we believe and it's never going to change. but more of a documentation of here is what we have discussed to date, and to be a continuing launching off point of we will continue discussing these topics as we move on. So I like that idea of a confession of faith, a doctrinal statement. It seems to be within the spirit of what was done with the Council of Chalcedony, trying to decide, is Jesus human or is Jesus God? They framed out, all right, well, here's the boundaries by which we are going to be held for that conversation. We're not going to come down and say, this is it, but here's how we want to frame the conversation. And even the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed were more on the lines of they were addressing certain things of that day and age, framing it out to say, all right, here's the boundaries. You can discuss anything you want to within these bounds, and it's a fairly broad set of boundaries. But the conversation is still an ongoing conversation. It's not quite as a rock solid. You have to believe exactly this and nothing more. It's a framing, a drawing a boundary around. There I go. I'm doing my flailing in the spirit again. Drawing around the conversation rather than chiseling it in stone for all eternity. Anyone else want to add to this on doctrinal statements of faith? We're at the 11 o'clock hour, which is kind of when I wanted to stop our broadcast tonight, but I'm willing to go on for a few minutes more if you guys have more things you want to say. Silence implies consent. So thank you guys for joining in the discussion tonight. There's a lot of questions that I wanted to talk about with denominations and conferences and things that I had outlined in the event invite that we didn't get to. What I'll do is we'll see about scheduling another one where we continue this conversation, pick up here where we left off. Maybe we can get some of these other folks to be able to join in and not have quite so much of the technology problems that they were having, and see if we can broaden the conversation to some other folks. The broadcast is going to be recorded on my YouTube channel, and then I'm going to be linking it as a post on the MennoNerds.com website. So you can link to it from there if you want to share it around with other people. Also, I'd be really interested to hear you guys, if you have a blog that you're running, if you wanted to give some other additional reflections and keep the conversation going between now and the next broadcast on this whole idea of denominations, history, statements of faith, the good and the bad, all this kind of stuff. It'd be really neat to see how each of us, what our takeaways have been from this conversation. Again, thank you guys for coming, and look forward to talking with you guys more in the future. Have a good evening.
All right, take care, y'all.
Good night, all.
Bye, guys.